there's so much in this book, Eben, and it's so fascinating. And right at the start of the book, you take us straight to Hong Kong, right? And into this context where this huge announcement is being made. And the question that immediately jumps to mind, and from that point on, we're on a roller coaster of information, and yeah, the thing that sort of jumps to my mind at that point is think, wow, there must be so much behind this for you. How did you come to this topic? What brought you here in the first place?
So I'm actually going to start a few years before Hong Kong in Washington, D.C. So many people remember this summit in Hong Kong as kind of the moment where kind of CRISPR emerged on the global stage amidst this controversy about the world's first genetically modified children. But it actually, for me, began 5 years earlier in Washington, D.C. So there was an earlier summit where people started talking about this new tool, CRISPR, and how we should use it. And I wandered into this event at the National Academies of Science, in part thanks to my earlier work. At the time I was teaching at Princeton University, I had a book that had just come out about my work as an art curator. And one of the people that I had curated into this art exhibit called the Multi-Species Salon is pictured here, Adam Zaretsky. He's kind of the bad boy of bioart. He likes to do provocative things that get people talking, stirs up controversy. So I ended up at this very straight-laced meeting in Washington, D.C. With Adam as my companion. We were staying in an apartment. And basically, I got to hear things from the main stage of this summit that were very similar to things that Adam had been talking about for years. So Robin Lovell Badge, one of the organizers of the summit, he talked about how it would be relatively trivial to make green people that glow green under UV light. He said that probably wouldn't be that useful. You might, go to a disco club every once in a while where you would have a chance to show off your green glowing inner nature. But there's a lot of other things. You could make, soldiers that feel no pain, children that might have massive muscles. So, at that earlier moment, people were speculating about what might happen. And then a few years later, I found myself checking into a hotel in Hong Kong, not on the sidelines this time. The first summit, I was just kind of there in the audience listening, but I'd been invited to speak on the ethics panel. And I'd never heard of this guy who was sitting on the couch talking with Jennifer Doudna. Doudna I'd heard of. Doudna created CRISPR, or at least showed how it could be used to change DNA. But in this hotel, I saw this guy on the couch and learned that things were trending on CNN that I had no idea were going on. So we were there to talk about, in theory, how to use CRISPR. Again, building on that earlier conversation. But somebody had just done it, and he had released videos just an hour earlier on YouTube saying that 2 healthy babies had been born. And very quickly you saw public opinion form. And what I bring to the book in understanding this man, Dr. He Jiankui, is kind of a sense of deep interest in science fiction and literature. And if you look at the archive of science fiction from about technology in Asia, you page back to 1912. Dr. Fu Manchu, this evil Oriental genius, steals Western knowledge and threatens the downfall of civilization. You see those same kind of images repeat in things like Blade Runner and things like Snow Crash from the 1990s, where there's these images of a dystopian, future in Asia where you can find illicit, gene editing and genetic engineering and mutants running wild on the streets. This picture, the video that's looping behind me is Shenzhen, the city where these children were created. And, I want to kind of give those images while also kind of giving you a way to read those images. So, as the controversy emerged, a lot of people compared Dr. He to Frankenstein. They called him the Chinese Frankenstein. But really there's more differences in these 2 figures than similarities. So if you go back to the original novel, Frankenstein wasn't this dim-witted green guy with electrodes sticking out of his neck. Mary Shelley's novel talks about this high-minded creature that only turned to violence after he was shunned by society. And Victor Frankenstein is alone in a castle, an aristocrat, and that couldn't be further from Dr. Hu's story. Dr. Hu's story is one of rags to riches. He grew up in this very rural village, a poor part of China, and then he came to Shenzhen. Shenzhen is this mega city. It's bigger than New York. It's where your smartphone was likely made. It's where they make drones, robotics, all kinds of cutting edge technologies are coming out of Shenzhen. Instead of this kind of creepy monster story, I basically found myself, after the Hong Kong summit, after Dr. Hu was detained, later put in jail, I went to his university campus and I found, instead of Blade Runner, instead of this like gritty dystopian scene with like smog in the air, it looked like San Diego, or it looked like Orlando, except, Shenzhen is a place where you have these massive skyscrapers. And what I also learned, Dr. Hu was not acting alone. He'd met with Jennifer Doudna many times in the years leading up to the experiment. Not that she had specific knowledge of what he was intending to do, but there were many international scientists involved, international investors. So the story of a rogue researcher, that's what Victor Frankenstein was, right? He was a rogue alone in his castle doing things that, ultimately society rejected. There is a similarity, right? Even though he wasn't a rogue, he wasn't alone, he did something that many, many people have objected to. So, I set out, from that earlier experience of, working with artists in this biotechnology space to kind of think about how the human is being changed. Like, this was a consequential moment in history. So I really wanted to understand what kind of futures are coming into view for humanity.
Of course, and you make the point in the book that, of course, he was connected through his studies in the United States, had his mentors still engaged with his work in different ways. So you're right, not at all alone, and yet in the aftermath of doing the thing, he's the one who sort of ended up on the receiving end of the punishment. You make a really good point there about the future. Obviously, as the story unfolds through this book, you talk about how you go and then visit and interact with various components of this ecosystem that sit around the science, both those who are on the inside of it and those who are potentially critiquing it from the outside or trying to push the boundaries of what gene editing might produce. And it gives a really rich panorama. But as we reach the end of the book, one of the questions, I guess, that is hanging for me, having read it, is, right, what does Eben think happens next? So given that you're the person who's written the book and you've been engaging with all these ideas and these people through this time, where do you think we're heading, Eben? What are the most likely near future scenarios for gene editing?
So one of the near future scenarios is a cure for cancer. And that cure for cancer comes along with a radical new era of medical inequality. So if we're thinking about these technologies as being disruptive, they're not just disruptive on a molecular level. It's not just that they're kind of breaking DNA, and I'll explain actually what CRISPR is in a moment, but these are going to disrupt society and the healthcare industry in some very dramatic ways. So in the book I talk about the world's first gene therapy. I'll come back to that in a little bit. But what emerged with this revolutionary new treatment for leukemia was a revolutionary new pricing structure. So $400,000 for one dose. And a lot of the hype surrounding genetic medicine or CRISPR gene editing is that this is going to be a one and done cure. You're going to fix it at the DNA level, all done, story's over. But that's not what these patients are experiencing. I basically followed some of these early people who participated in the clinical trials and found that relapses actually do happen. So you might need a second dose, another $400,000. And since the book came out, there's been, I'd say about 8 or 10 new gene therapies for multiple myeloma, another form of cancer, other relatively rare conditions like spinal muscular atrophy. That one has a $2.1 million price tag. So, these have real medical applications, but they also are going to introduce all kinds of new societal problems. And before we get too much further, I just want to explain kind of what CRISPR is. CRISPR is something that basically grabs a hold of DNA and breaks it. It's called a double-stranded break. And it's hard to see or understand on a molecular level what's going on, so we use a lot of different metaphors. And I actually don't think gene editing is a particularly good metaphor. If you're a writer, that you write a sentence, you make a typo, you just back up the cursor and hit the backspace and type in the right letter. This doesn't work like that. It actually produces damage. Here's some images that people have made. Gene surgery is, in my opinion, a little bit better because, with a surgeon's knife, there's a slip and there could be an unintended error. Genetic engineering suggests that there's some continuity between these much older technologies for tinkering with DNA and CRISPR. But I personally like to think of the Reaper drone as a good metaphor for understanding how CRISPR works. You give a drone some GPS coordinates, it zeroes in on part of the genome, and it sometimes takes out the terrorist. And then sometimes it takes out the wedding party. And sometimes it goes astray and hits the totally wrong target. So CRISPR does that. It produces targeted damage. And in technical terms, what it does is produce targeted mutagenesis. So in other words, CRISPR makes mutants. And that's one of the reasons that I give the book that title, The Mutant Project. Oh, and I forgot. I had this picture queued up, and I mentioned this earlier, right? So from the main stage in the summit, they talked about the potential to make genetically modified children with huge muscles. So this is a picture of a child who's not a result of a CRISPR experiment. His name is Giuliano Stroh. He was born with a rare mutation and had massive muscles. This is him at the age of 5, and he looks like Arnold Schwarzenegger. So it's possible to reproduce that. You can target a gene called myostatin and delete it. So CRISPR does do targeted deletions, and you will produce a kid with massive muscles, but that child will also likely have heart trouble, smaller organs. So genes are basically super complicated. You could take out a gene for causing pain, but it's kind of important to sense pain. There's a lot of kids born around the world every year that lack the ability to feel pain, but often their life expectancy isn't very long. They either burn themselves on a stove, some bite off their own tongues. One Pakistani 16-year-old became famous in his neighborhood for doing these painful stunts, and he ended up jumping off a roof, and he died. So, there's all kinds of dystopian futures that are coming into view alongside those cures for cancer. But maybe cure is the wrong language. That's what the companies, the hype around CRISPR is trying to sell us on. The radically new kinds of treatments, they might indeed make something like chemotherapy obsolete. My mom went through chemo. I watched her hair fall out. I watched all the horrible side effects with that. So, if I get leukemia, I would love to have one of these gene therapies, but, at what cost? Who's going to pay for that? Is society going to pay for it? Is the national healthcare system going to pay for that? In places that don't have national healthcare, is this just something for the rich?
I'd love to come back to this question of commercialization and cost with you in a moment. I think it'd be a great place to finish our discussion today. But just before we go there, there's another question there about decision making, because obviously we're working on on the microscopic level here, and there are all sorts of decisions that need to be made about where things are targeted, what gets targeted, etc. So obviously scientists working in this space need some sort of roadmap to help them with their decision making. And often, in academia, we talk about this, in terms of ethics. You talk in the book about how the scientists involved in these projects are constantly balancing, ethical considerations and moderations with the drive for experimentation and a desire for new discovery and all of that kind of stuff. And I guess the thing I wanted to ask you about is, well, how do you, having spent some time now interacting with people working in this space, how does it work? Should we be concerned about the sort of, the ethical considerations of those who are involved in potentially producing mutant children? Is there anything that may be going wrong fundamentally with the science? Should we be worried about anything?
So I want to introduce you to one key decision maker. His name is Lin Jitong. He was the head of Harmony Care Hospital. And Harmony Care basically had an internal ethics panel, and he was the chair of it. And as part of that panel, he declared this was ethical. And then on the day that the news broke from Hong Kong about the babies, he went on the Associated Press. This is a picture, a still from the Associated Press interview, where he said in public, "I think that this experiment is ethical." And in part, in your question, I kind of hear like, how do we even know that some of these things are going on? How do we kind of reckon with the decisions that are being made behind closed doors that might have broad societal ramifications? He wasn't in consultation, with the policy community, with organizations like the World Health Organization, these global bodies that have been deliberating about these issues. But Lin Jitong, who was an investor in Dr. He's project, and maverick scientists like Dr. He are making decisions that might potentially impact all of us. So I see this first experiment as just one first step. This could go in a lot of different directions if people continue on this path. So to try to understand what was going on behind the scenes, I basically showed up to the hospital, and I went there. This is a place that has a motto: American medicine and only for you. They have a lot of pictures of white people there. Most of the customers are mainland Chinese, but there's kind of this aspirational sense that they're going to bring this international medical expertise to Shenzhen, China. Again, this is the same city that's kind of rolling in the background as I'm talking. When I went to the hospital, I didn't know if the actual experiment was done here. On the day that I showed up, there were media reports that the hospital was, denying this publicly. They said that, Lin Jitong had misspoken. He was forced to resign as a director. So I wanted to basically figure out what had happened here. I tried to figure out what facilities they had. After I go on some adventures in the hospital that are cataloged in the book, where I'm meeting with doctors, actually giving clinical samples of my own self to this hospital to figure out what techniques are on offer. And I basically learned that they don't even have IVF facilities here. It ended up being this very complicated story involving, genomics work being done on his university campus, the ethics approval given here at a place that doesn't even do in vitro fertilization, the actual fertility treatments being done, one in Bangkok in Thailand, another on another side of town in Shenzhen. So multiple institutions were involved in this. And, basically I just wanted to get a sense of this place, what was actually happening there. And, going to some of your fundamental questions about the values that are animating these experiments and whether or not we should be interrogating these, I found that basically a profit motive was underlying the whole business plan of this hospital. Harmony Healthcare is part of a network of hospitals called Putian, and this is well known in China. And it basically is emblematic of this new profit-driven healthcare system. Putian, in many ways, even before this scandal, was viewed as being a bad, dangerous system. There was a young Chinese man who had cancer and sought an experimental treatment at another Putian hospital, and he died after paying a lot of money, and it became a big deal on social media. So in some respects, the fact that he situated his experiment here really contributed to the controversy. But in terms of the actual values and the possible futures of this technology, part of what I discovered in the same hospital, which was mostly almost like a boutique hotel for people to come give birth in, there was also a plastic surgery clinic. So while you're recovering from giving birth, you can get all kinds of plastic surgery treatments, including skin lightening, Asian eyelid removal. And for me, I got to think about some of these questions about eugenics that have been with us for a long, long time. So eugenics literally means good genes. And there were racist political projects associated with the eugenics movement almost from the inception. In the United States, you saw sterilization campaigns targeting immigrants, Italians, Irish people, people from Mexico, as well as the disabled and the gay community. These people, all these communities were targeted with eugenic sterilization campaigns. And there's a real possibility that as these genetic technologies not only are detecting differences in the human population, but actually changing the fundamental genes, people might aspire towards a future that makes us all look the same. So the beauty comes with the geopolitics, and it turns out that the plastic surgery craze in East Asia was actually started by American physicians during the Korean War. They gave Asian eyelid removal surgery to their translators. Skin lightening treatments came later. But there's colonialism embedded in these ideas of beauty, and in some ways, the book explores the complicated questions that come when people internalize the sense that I'm ugly because society's telling me so. But there's serious questions. If you're less likely to get shot by a police officer in the United States for having lighter skin, maybe you're going to want to try to solve that problem for your child by editing its genes. But for me, that's the totally wrong solution. It's trying to present this technological solution, this individual solution for a societal problem. Very difficult political and social work needs to be done to solve police violence. I don't think genome editing is the answer.
Thank you. That's a terrific response. And I guess it reinforces this idea that, well, there should be someone shining a light to these questions. There should be people calling for the technological fixes to be held to account. I guess one of the ways that we can explore that a bit further is to talk about what people from different perspectives might bring to a topic like this. Now, you yourself are an anthropologist, at least in your role at Deakin University. As an associate professor in anthropology. Although I note from your CV, you've got quite a diverse sort of background anyway. Let's stick with anthropology for a minute and say, well, I wonder, is there something that an anthropological lens brings then to this discussion to help expand or illuminate our thinking about this topic? I wonder, should these labs be engaging anthropologists or ethicists on their staff alongside the technologists who are producing the technology?
So at that first Human Genome Editing Summit, actually the slide I was hoping for is not there. At the first summit that I went to, there was a presentation, or actually somebody from Novartis got up to the microphone and asked a question. And later I went to talk with this person. And basically, they were enraged that a social scientist named Ruha Benjamin got up and sort of questioned some of the fundamental ethical things that were going on in the field. And he told me that they actually had bioethics built into the program, that there was someone there on the payroll kind of ticking the boxes. And I think in some ways it's a question about knowledge and power, and like who gets to be making a call as to whether or not something is ethical. Is this simply a kind of a bioethical gun for hire, someone that you give a salary to and invite to participate in these meetings, or do you want to be transparent and open up these spaces where decisions are happening? So Ruha Benjamin's talk at that summit was basically about inequality and innovation, and basically how the future is a contested field. And her insistence is that we don't just think about inequalities in the present or how to deal with medical equity after a new technology is invented, but she thinks about the imagination as a battlefield, as a place where different hopes and dreams about the future come into contact and battle it out. And some people have the resources to make particular futures arrive in the present. And often those futures, those dreams of the elite, end up being nightmares for other people who have to live with those futures. So, what I was trying to do with the book as an anthropologist is basically visit the people who are living with nightmares in the shadows of these spectacular worlds around gene editing. So this led me in Philadelphia, where they did the first CRISPR clinical trial in the United States. I didn't stay in the Sheraton or the Ritz Hotel. I went to stay in Fishtown, this gentrifying neighborhood, historically African American. In the summertime, you walk down the streets and people are just sleeping out in the open. There's hypodermic needles everywhere. This is a city where Black and brown people are living with the kind of cancer that was being treated by this experiment at a disproportionate level. They are the ones suffering. But then I walk into this gleaming white space of Penn Medicine, this new building, massive facility. They're developing the world's first CAR T cell. This is basically a synthetic immune system that can fight things like cancer. And this was to treat, again, this leukemia. So I walk into the Cancer Survivor Hall of Fame, and it's all white people. So that inequality in the present is reverberating into these futures to come. I couldn't stop thinking of Gil Scott-Heron. He's this African-American musician from the 70s who has this fabulous song about Whitey on the Moon. He talks about how a rat bit his sister, how she got sick, and there's Whitey on the Moon. So kind of putting, healthcare and basic human well-being in the context of scientific innovation. Do we want to fund the moonshot, or do we want to fund healthcare for people who otherwise can't afford it? In Australia, it's a different question in some ways than the States. Here, pretty much everybody can get access to a Medicare card, at least if you have certain visas. But in the U.S., it's different. But nonetheless, I found people in the book who were doing the hard work. Even some of the patients ended up signing up for these first gene editing experiments. Some of the HIV positive activists that I interviewed are doing the work to make sure that people get health care regardless of race, regardless of gender, regardless of sexual orientation or immigration status. So, where do we want to orient our future dreams? Do we want to orient them towards these disruptive kinds of medicine that are going to, transform society? I mean, that does seem to be part of the promise, right? I mean, I don't want to dismiss these technologies, but I think there must be a way that we can hold science and justice together and address them at the same time.
There's a lot of deep feeling that comes with this topic, and it's very personal. I can imagine that in speaking to people who've experienced a whole range of really difficult circumstances, or who have put themselves forward for really uncertain medical experiments, that it's hard not to take that on. Well, you wouldn't be human if you didn't take that on board, yourself as well. And I think just continuing this question of what different perspectives we bring, perhaps one of the, and also speaking to you as a fellow anthropologist, one of the challenges that we have in academia and in academic writing, much as we try and many of us try and affect change in the world, one of the challenges that we have is the conventions of academic writing often are quite limiting. We may not always have the opportunity to talk about things the way we might like to, or with the degree of clarity that, say, someone who's an investigative journalist or an independent writer might do so. And I find one of the things that I found really refreshing about the Mutant Project as a book was, on the one hand, it's obvious that the book is based in a lot of research skill. Like there are skills behind the information collection that underpins the book, and that those are part of the academic world. The book itself, though, is written in a way that's very accessible, and in fact, reveals details that perhaps might not appear in academic writing. So I think it's interesting that it's kind of cutting across these two domains, to me at least. I was wondering if you might say a bit more about your how you made decisions about the way the book would be written. Was it in order to be more accessible? Were you trying to make sure that that this topic was something that could be interacted with by a greater sort of cross section of the community? How did you go about making these decisions about how to write, Eben?
Yeah, so for starters, I should say that I've been trained by some very remarkable people. One is an undergraduate mentor, Maria Vespiri, who is both a journalist and an anthropologist, and then as a PhD student by James Clifford, who sort of got us to think about the anthropologist as an author. His most prominent book is Predicament of Culture. He also did a book called Writing Culture, which I highly recommend. They're both important interventions in the history of anthropology, but also I think accessible, philosophical, but accessible. And in approaching this topic, again, kind of through science fiction, I sort of use science fiction as a way to look at reality, historical reality as it is, and also as it might be. And that was one of the ways, one of the strategies that I use to kind of approach otherwise pretty dense technical material. Part of my job here, I saw it as kind of a science writer. I have an undergraduate degree in biology, so I can read the research papers and kind of understand how things like CRISPR work on a molecular level and try to translate that understanding into plain language. And I think it also comes from, a familiarity with this literature, looking at misrepresentations, like representations like Blade Runner that carry those echoes of colonialism. But how do you tell a different story about these kinds of spaces? How do you tell a story? In approaching Dr. Hu's story, I didn't want to celebrate it. He made some serious ethical missteps, and I tried to chronicle those. And I think the biggest one is really misleading people about the health of these children. His videos on YouTube claimed, 2 babies born as healthy as any others, when in fact they were in the neonatal intensive care unit. So working hard with my sources, with members of his lab, I was able to piece together a story about their health and well-being that hadn't been told yet by journalists. And I think in part it's having an academic position that lets me explore much longer term research horizons. I'd been working on this for 4 or 5 years by the time this experiment with Dr. Hu came along. So I knew how to ask questions in a way that were different from the journalists. So the lab ended up trusting me with this material. I reported that the babies were not breathing as they were born, again, in the neonatal intensive care unit. And also thinking about the subtleties experienced by their parents. In part, this experiment was shrouded in secrecy because the men were HIV positive. And in China, HIV positive status comes with all kinds of discrimination. You might lose your job. You're unlikely to find a marriage partner. So simply naming the parents in the media, like that would be a major catastrophe for these families, not to mention the particular children who were targeted with stigmatizing rhetoric on social media. So I guess, for me, my tendency was to listen to the powerful companies, the scientists that were kind of defining the research agenda, but also to situate their stories, like the claims about the power of these technologies and the futures that are coming, to situate those stories in the actual experience of people who are living with medical problems like HIV. So it turns out, I talked about how we can't really treat police brutality with gene editing, as much as a child might want to protect her future, as much as a mother might want to protect her child from being pulled over by a cop and shot in the US. I don't think that's the right approach. And I don't think ultimately this experiment that Dr. Hu did was the right approach either. He tried to deal, HIV is not a medical problem anymore that's so serious and catastrophic. You can live with the virus for decades now and enjoy a life expectancy that's very similar to normal. That's the case in Australia. That's the case in China, where medicine is readily available, in the US. So these couples were living with stigma. They wanted to have a healthy baby, and they turned to this laboratory, in hopes of also ushering in a cure. So I really tried to, hold these powerful institutions to account, explore some of the ways that this particular experiment was nested within these networks and powerful institutions. I also talk about the Chinese Communist Party, their role in supporting the experiment. But as an anthropologist, I think we're drawn to the human stories, the stories that are often marginalized by society. So yeah, one of the big things that I explore in the book is what it's like to live with HIV in China. That's a whole subplot that's part of the story.
I've got a question for you in case we have any budding writers in the room, which is often the case at writers' festivals. There are people who are, who take cues from the authors that they get to meet and the books that they've produced, about this kind of writing where you're kind of cutting across science writing and academic sort of writing and trying to reach the public in an open kind of way with a social justice objective underneath that as well, of trying to keep the powerful accountable. What advice might you have for someone else who's inspired by your book, Eben, and wants to approach another, because I'm sure the future will bring us many other topics like this, who wants to unpack a topic like this? How might other writers follow the kind of path that you've gone down?
So part of my writing practice involves writing a lot. So for every hour that I spend either interviewing somebody or visiting a place, I try to spend 2 hours writing about it, and I try to do that right away. Before you think that you have a good memory, maybe. You might take notes, and in the moment it seems like your notes are legible. But if you fast forward like a month or 5 months, you might have no clue what your notes mean. So for me, a very important part of the writing process is just doing it right away. And that might be on a high-speed train between Guangzhou and Beijing right after I negotiated access to another lab where they were doing CRISPR embryo experiments. That might be on the plane as I just left my last interview. Or it might be like, I think, early on in my career, I made the mistake of trying to do too much all at once. So scheduling those downtime, like I'm going to do Monday and Tuesday and actually go out into the world and talk to people. I'm going to lock myself in my hotel for 3 days and just sit there and write. And then for me, writing is also rewriting, and it's also a very social process. And I think one of the things that I really try to do is share my writing with other writers, but also with the people that I'm writing about. I like to give people the opportunity to see how I'm representing them, and I'll often write an email after I haven't talked to someone for a few months, saying like here's what I've written up. Let me know if there's any matters of fact or interpretation that you disagree with, or you want to see corrected. And I don't always take those corrections on board. And I don't share it with everybody. I didn't share my writing with Lin Jitung, in part because he didn't respond. In part, there's sometimes people you want to talk to and they don't want to talk to you. But yeah, I find that that's part of my ethical practice as well. It's kind of like co-writing almost. Like if I'm talking to an HIV patient who's lived with this and survived, often they might even understand the science better than me. So, I feel like that social part of writing and the openness is a really important part of my practice.
Thanks. I think we've got time for one more question, Eben, and it's a really important one and a great one for us to finish on. One of the most important themes that weaves its way through the Mutant Project is that of social justice and equity. It's there at the beginning, it's there at the very end, all the way through your casting comparisons between the cost of different kinds of treatments versus the ability of people to pay, or even if they should be asked to do so. There's definitely many inferences that these sort of bioscience companies and the commercialization of research in this area is a potential future source of inequity in the world, if not already. But having said that, and just to sort of play devil's advocate for a moment, the big bioscience companies, I don't know that any of them have ever really suggested that they are working for the public good. They may have motherhood statements about the sorts of things that they're interested in, but I can't think of any of them that have ever actually said that they're here for the purposes of equity and social justice. I don't think that's ever been something that they have suggested that they're in this for. So why should we expect this of them? Why is it so important that social justice and equity remain elevated in a discussion, particularly if the major players in that discussion sort of aren't really on that path anyway?
So in justifying this $400,000 price tag, I've had members of companies like Novartis, Editas, Pfizer tell me that they need that price tag to fund their research. They tell me they need that price tag because it's so expensive to manufacture the therapies. One distinctive thing about the kinds of gene therapies that are being offered to adults is that it's personalized medicine. They take your cells, they genetically modify them, and put them back. So I toured a number of these facilities. In Pennsylvania, I went to this one where Joe Biden famously launched his cancer moonshot when he was vice president. He was looking into this massive suite of clean rooms. He wanted to go in. The security detail said that they had to send in the dogs first. The biologists wouldn't let them send in the dogs, but they snapped this iconic picture of Biden kind of looking at this clean facility. Indeed, these facilities are big and takes a lot of overhead to run them, but everyone who's an industry insider insists that they're still price gouging. You can kind of add up all the costs, and you can get a gene therapy that's much more affordable. And it's a little disingenuous to say we need this price to fund our research. A lot of the intellectual property that goes into these projects, whether it's a vaccine, like we saw with Moderna or Pfizer, or I'm very grateful that I've been triple vaxxed and that I'm not going to get seriously ill or die of COVID. But I'm also unhappy that a company in many ways use taxpayer dollars to make billions off of the suffering of millions of people. So how do we hold these companies to account? In some ways, I'd like to articulate an argument for more public funding for research, but also for the prioritization of science and justice from the very moment that a research project gets off the ground. You need disabled people in the room. You need patient advocates. You need people who are informed about some of these more nuanced ethical questions, not only at the point when the treatment gets rolled out, but when you decide whether or not to pursue something as a line of research. There's ways of doing gene therapy that are much more affordable. There's ways of designing something very similar to an mRNA vaccine that would deliver a gene, for really pennies. So what kinds of genetic medicine do we want? Do we want this personalized genetic medicine? Because that's what the companies are making right now. I really think there's an opportunity to question some of these bigger picture issues. And I feel like we're still unsettled about the future of gene editing in reproductive medicine. About 20 years ago, there was a lot of controversy about cloning. We had Dolly the sheep. We had reports that some people had actually been cloned. But largely that conversation is settled. Human cloning is not something that generally is going to happen in the world. There wasn't a clear use for it, but I think it's unclear in this case still. And I think the kinds of eugenic potentialities, the potential for rich couples or rich countries to try to optimize the genes of the future generations, that's also going to result in inequity. But it could also result in some tragic backfiring. You know, part of in addressing that question of science and justice, one of the key people in the book I talked to is a biochemist. He's someone who has a body that's very different from mine. His mother took thalidomide when she was pregnant. So as a result, he gets around in a wheelchair. He is happy crawling. He's able to work in this biochemistry lab, and he's a very articulate and sharp critic of, you know, the able-bodied norms that are embedded in the world around us. But he also questions, you know, if you strive for a perfect child, if you try to optimize your child, and your child is imperfect or even disabled, can you live with that? And I think I'd just like to end on that question from Gregor Wolbring. You know, can we live with these mistakes of science?
Well, Eben Kirksey, thank you for sharing your insights as an author with us today at the Bendigo Writers Festival. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Dan. It's been a pleasure.